Virtually unknown in the pages of history, Lyda Conley in the story of the Huron Cemetery in Kansas City teaches us lessons about the qualities of a great leader. Her story reminds us that important leaders and their legacies are not always recorded or easily found in official history books, with their memories enshrined through monuments or marked by national holidays. It is not these things that determine or define a leader or legacy. Like many members of oppressed minorities, Conley's story is about the very challenge that these leaders face when they seek to preserve the legacy of their people. Her struggle is emblematic of the obstacles that many minority leaders face when they refuse to simply be silent and accept the history that those with privilege and power wish to write for them. Rather than stand idly by while the graves of her ancestors were uprooted, Lyda Conley led a battle for history itself, seeking to preserve the story of the triumphs and tragedies of the Wendat of Kansas, whose complex story might otherwise have been forgotten but for her efforts. Born in 1869 to Elizabeth Burton Zane Conley, a descendant of many Wendat leaders, and Andrew Conley, an English immigrant, Lyda Conley was one of 4 children. She always strived to practice law and do things other women had never done. Lyda went to college in Parkville, Missouri. She taught at the Spalding Business College and Sunday school at the 7th Street Methodist Episcopal Church. In 1902, she graduated from the Kansas City School of Law and on June 21st became one of the first women to be admitted to the Missouri bar.
Conley's story begins with the story of her people, the Wendat. Wendat people came from 3 different but related tribes, all part of the Huron Confederacy. By 1640, plagued by disease from colonial contact, between 50 to 66% of the population had died. In 1830, the Indian Removal Act allowed the government to move Indians to unsettled territories in exchange for land desired for white European settlement. In 1842, the Wendat were forced to give up their large land holdings in Ohio and Michigan in exchange for money and a grant of 148,000 acres of land west of the Mississippi. The Wendat settled on the banks of the Missouri and Kansas rivers, what today is Kansas City. Between the years 1843 and 1844, while waiting for the land they were promised, many Wendats died from diseases and terrible flooding. In the fall of 1843, the Wendat buried large numbers of their dead in what is known today as the Huron Cemetery, the oldest cemetery in the state of Kansas. In 1854, the Wendat were again to be removed, this time to Oklahoma. A number of Wendat did not want to move and give up their land once more, but staying in Kansas had a price. Conley's grandmother and mother were among the Kansas Wendat who were given the choice to either stay in Kansas and become U.S. citizens, losing their tribal identity and rights, or move to new lands in Oklahoma where they could maintain their tribal identity.
In 1899, the Wendat Tribal Council in Oklahoma decided to sell the land of the burial ground to try to make money for the tribe. When Kansas descendants of the Wendat found out, people like Lyda Conley were furious. Their protests initially prevented the sale, but in 1906, Congress authorized the sale of the Huron Indian Cemetery and the removal of the remains to another cemetery. It was at that time that Lyda Conley and her sisters, Lena and Ida, established Fort Conley, a 6 by 8 foot encampment on the cemetery grounds. They locked the front gate with a sign, "Trespass at your peril." Lyda Conley stated, "In this cemetery are buried our ancestors. Why should we not be proud of our ancestors and protect their graves? We shall do it, and woe be to the man that first attempts to steal a body. We are part owners of the ground and have the right, under the law, to keep out trespassers." On June 11, 1907, Lyda Conley challenged the sale of the cemetery by filing a petition in the United States Circuit Court for the District of Kansas, calling for a judicial order. She argued that her position as a citizen Wendat gave her rights to the possession of the land. She cited the Constitution numerous times, focusing on Article 6, which states that treaties are the supreme law of the land. She argued that it was being violated. Over and over again, the Wendat people, like other Native American tribes, had been promised land as well as other goods and rights, and whenever it seemed in the interest of the government, the treaties were changed with no regard for the tribe.
Native peoples have different ways of saying this in different contexts, but it's usually something like we as a people and our land are kind of the same. And what happens to the land happens to us.
On July 1st, 1907, the defendant in the case, Secretary James Garfield, on behalf of the Department of the Interior, challenged Conley's petition. Among their arguments, they asserted that Conley wasn't actually a citizen of the Wendat tribe, but a citizen of the U.S. because her mother had stayed in Kansas. The government argued that Congress could repeal any treaty it decided to if they had good and sufficient reasons. The call for dismissal was filed on July 1st, 1907, and decided on the very next day by District Court Judge John Pollock. Because the case was ruled on so quickly, historians are suspicious that Conley wasn't given the fair or impartial hearing she deserved. Weeks later, she filed a number of court documents calling again for an injunction. Her arguments drew on contract and constitutional law. Most importantly, Conley argued something which continues to be a major legal issue for Indian tribes in court today, that burial grounds are sacred for Native Americans and that the United States courts had a moral responsibility to address her claim. Conley filed an appeal to the United States Supreme Court on July 2, 1907. It was granted in October, but wasn't heard for more than 2 years. When she traveled to Washington at the end of 1909, no one would sponsor her before the court, so she had to argue for the case herself pro se. In January 1910, she became the third woman and first Native American woman to argue before the U.S. Supreme Court in Conley v. Ballinger, Secretary of the Interior. Conley used patriotic images to talk about what sacred land meant and why it needed to be protected.
Like Jacob of old, I too, when I shall be gathered unto my people, desire that they bury me with my fathers in Huron cemetery, the most sacred and hallowed spot on earth to me. And I cannot believe that this is superstitious reverence any more than I can believe that the reverence every true American has for the grave of Washington at Mount Vernon is a superstitious reverence.
Although the court did not rule in her favor, Conley still did not give up. After 3 years of legal battles, Conley returned to the cemetery and joined with her sister Lyda to guard the graves of their ancestors. Casey Kansan described them as
praying aloud to the Great Spirit by night and guarding the graves of their ancestors by day. The Conley sisters have kept a constant vigil at the old Indian burial ground. Even in the coldest months of winter, they did not desert their post, and when the warm and pleasant days and the summer nights arrived, they were found ever faithful in their watch. In late July 1910, after losing the Supreme Court case, federal marshals came to destroy the Conley sisters' shack. But determined as ever, the women rebuilt it at least 2 more times before the government gave up.
Their persistence and dedication became well known throughout the entire country, and political leaders rallied around their cause. In particular, Kansas Senator Charles Curtis, who would later become vice president, visited Huron Cemetery in 1912, and he became taken with the devotion of these sisters. He helped lead the cause to save the cemetery.
After many years of struggle, Lyda Conley's battle was eventually won. For the rest of her life, she guarded over the graves of her parents, keeping alive the story of the Wendat people in Kansas. Conley died in May of 1946, and she is appropriately buried in the cemetery. Her 2 sisters continued to guard the cemetery after her death. In 1971, Kansas City officials, historians, and Wendat community members finally placed the cemetery on the National Register of Historic Places, and the Conley sisters are safely resting there to this day.
If it's sort of a miracle that there are still Native peoples, if it's something of a miracle that that burial ground in Kansas City is still there, it isn't a complete miracle. It is a testament to the resolve, the perseverance of people like Conley.
Everyone who sees the cemetery in Kansas City or hears Conley's story cannot help but be inspired by her pursuit for justice for her ancestors and her people. Native American tribes like the Wendat were dispossessed again and again, but women like Lyda Conley ensured that they could not be robbed of their voice and their power to tell their story. Her leadership reminds us to listen to the voices of those whose forgotten stories, tragedies, and triumphs are part of our American legacy.